As you can see, we're not playing around at this conference. We're really getting to the deep issues. And the ones that, as I think Gar mentioned, which I think is so interesting, that all these movements that many of us have been part of, did not take on the system issue. So I think all of us here are ready to do that, probably already doing it, and that's very exciting. So the next speaker we have is from the Institute of Policy Studies in Washington, D.C., and Janet Redman is the director of the Climate Policy Program for the Institute of Policy Studies. And as a founding participant of the Global Justice Now network, I think she was also in New York, right? Yes. She's bringing hard-hitting policy analysis into grassroots and grassroots organizing. She's currently working with grassroots coalitions and global campaigns like the Climate Justice Alliance, the Global Campaign to Demand Climate Justice. Her focus is developing innovative policies to reinvest in the new economy. She holds a master's degree from Clark University in International Development and Social Change, and a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Science from the University of Vermont. We're very pleased to have her. I've heard Janet speak before and I thought she's the one we need to have at the conference to talk about policy. So we're trying to get to all levels of how we change the system. Please welcome Janet Redman.
All right, I know I'm the last person before lunch, so I'm keeping myself timed here so I don't keep you from eating. So I just want to thank you, Georgia, for having us all here, and thanks to the Praxis Peace Institute, and thanks to you all for being inside on such a gorgeous day. I'm really excited to be here. I'm from the Institute for Policy Studies. We're the oldest progressive multi-issue think tank in the United States. We've been turning ideas into action for 50 years at the intersection of peace, justice, and the environment, and we believe that social movements armed with good ideas, flexing their collective muscle in the centers of power, be that local, national, or international, make social change. And it's because of that intersectionality that we, as a community of public scholars, as policy nerds basically, were involved in spreading the word about the People's Climate March in New York City a couple weeks ago, and helped organize public conversations connecting things like government spending on military versus climate security, interpreting debates that were going on inside the United Nations that week, and unpacking false solutions to the climate crisis and putting forward new economic, cultural, and organizing approaches to get to systemic change. So I was one of the 400,000 people on the street, as were many of you, which I'm excited about. And before I went to the march, I have to admit that I was a little bit skeptical. So I'm sure many of us have been to many marches, stopping the World Bank from its destructive practices, trying to stop NAFTA, stopping the invasion of Iraq. And how much had marching really brought about? To me, my experience, not a whole heck of a lot. I wasn't at the Battle of Seattle, so I missed that one, and I wasn't around yet in 1963, so I missed the March on Washington. So while I was dedicated to supporting the organizing and the organizers of the march, I was certainly a little bit cynical, particularly of a march that didn't really seem to have a deep demand, yet was a display of mass public opinion. And what I discovered in a lot of the activity before the march was that I wasn't alone. So before the march in New York, I was up in Brooklyn, where I had been invited to speak for an event organized by the Climate Action Committee of Brooklyns for Peace, which is a group kind of like the Praxis Peace Institute that's been really visionary in looking at the connections between a world in endless war and an economy fueled by endless extraction. Or, put more positively, that a peaceful world is one in which our economy is not at war with our planet, as Naomi mentioned. And the panel was about connecting climate and conflict and the impact and the implications for action, and all the speakers were super engaging, I thought. But once we all kind of finished our remarks, it was really clear that the audience almost exclusively wanted to talk about the climate march, and overwhelmingly were raising the question, okay, is a march, even the biggest march ever about climate, even one that's targeting the world's leaders who are going to be in town, ever going to be enough to think about, to stop this crisis? And of course, the answer is no, of course not, it's a march. And I think a lot of the folks who were raising that question already knew that answer, already had that answer in the front of their mind. And so, after that, I kept wondering if what people really wanted was to be assured that there were other people present, other people in the room who felt that tug of urgency, that nagging feeling that it really has to be recognized that one single display of anything, even if it's mass public mobilization, isn't enough. And if what people really needed to see was that there was a whole picture that has to come together to confront the climate crisis in this case. A set of forces, a range of tactical fronts, a spectrum of tools. And so yes, we needed a mobilization, and it was really exciting and dynamic to be there. It shows we have critical mass of people who think that climate is really a problem. It brings new people to the table, new people into debate. In some ways, I think a lot of it it's a gateway drug for people to get engaged in a new conversation, to feel a part of a movement they may not have felt central to in the past. And we need all the other steps too. We need direct action. We need culture jamming. We need organizing. We need new narratives. We need electoral work. We need an inside-outside strategy to think about how to put movements and policy people together. And we need scholarship. And I would argue we need public policy that supports these other strands, that helps weave them together to make up what I think of as a fabric of social change. So now, on the other side of the march, I do feel like it had an impact. So having this surprising number of people in the street, 400,000, that's twice as many people as descended on Washington during the historic Civil Rights March. It's already changed a lot of the conversations. I was just this past week briefing the NAACP's new CEO and president about some of their work in climate change and where we see an organization that's specifically focused on the civil and human rights of African Americans in the United States being engaged. And for the first time, I think ever, the CEO was nodding along to a room full of people saying, this is a battle that's the central interest of people, African Americans in this country who are fighting for their civil rights. It's changed the way mainstream environmental organizations talk about who's part of that movement. I've been in conversations already here this morning where we've been reflecting on how this opens up a new opportunity for the kind of work we're doing connecting economics and environment. It's not the end game for sure, obviously, but it did open up some political space, and it shifted in some ways the optics, I think, of what a lot of people who weren't necessarily looking think is possible. And it raised the idea that this concern is really mainstream. I thought it was especially interesting to see a shift in who is a part of the climate movement at this march. And how the communities who are most impacted, as Osprey mentioned, the people at the front line of the climate crisis are also the folks at the front line of the economic crisis. At the march, there were Superstorm Sandy impacted communities like the Far Rockaways, who were pointing out that they were still without electricity and water weeks after folks in Manhattan had gotten that stuff back. My parents were there 6 months after visiting some friends. They had just opened the subway. They had just opened public transportation back to those areas. And they're the folks, of course, who've been organizing to construct more resilient communities, more economically resilient communities out of necessity. So in the march itself, in the coverage, and I think more importantly, in the organizing that went on behind the scenes, economic justice, income inequality, racial disparity, economic marginalization, and the policies that keep families in poverty was given a push closer to the center of the climate conversation. What I thought was incredibly important and was really demonstrated by the images that you can see when you look at the visuals of the march. It wasn't just frontline communities and communities of color, but it was people who were holding signs saying justice, security, home, land, labor, love. So signs that are actually talking about getting at the root, calling out Wall Street, calling out concentration of power, calling out the concentration of wealth, and how that actually is part of the front of our climate crisis, and solving that as a part of solving the broader environmental crisis. And so I was thinking about that a little bit, and what was the last big thing that happened in New York in my memory, and being from New Jersey, living on the East Coast, 9/11 to me was the biggest thing that happened in the past. And certainly it impacted people from all over the world, and of course here in California there were a lot of families who were coming home to California who were on those airplanes. But largely the story was a back east story and centered around New York. But what I thought was really important about that is we've been living with the consequences of that event for 13 years, and we've been living with an endless war on terror and war on our civil liberties in the policy space since then as well. And so for me, what that really brought forward was that these collective public experiences matter in particular because they can define a moment, and that moment can be enshrined in public policy, and that can be a good thing or a bad thing. But that public policy can change our lives and can really change history. So kind of reflecting that back on the climate march, if we can harness some of the energy from that space and grab a hold of the demand to link climate and economic justice, then I think we can move forward in helping build a public policy agenda that gets to the root causes of both climate change and inequality. And I really believe that intersection is at the heart of this conversation around economics of sustainability. One of the pushbacks that I've heard, and probably many folks feel, I feel it myself actually, from friends and allies that are critical of spending a whole lot of time and energy on public policy, rightly point out the fact that very little of use to the progressive, and certainly not to a radical systemic change, has made its way through Congress. And it's a pretty well accepted realization that right now DC is a disaster, and I won't argue that it's not. But I still see 4 reasons to keep public policy as a critical front in this larger struggle for a new economy. One, I always think of this, it's not like your little brother. If you ignore it, it doesn't go away. It still sticks around. 2, you can't just smash it. Unfortunately, it's not like the WTO in Seattle. If we can take it down, then we've gotten a barrier out of our way. If we take down DC functionally, if we take down public policy, we've got in some places just a gaping hole. I, for one, am actually pretty interested in a social contract where there's some collective responsibility. 3, because we need to reverse the rule rigging that's happening right now in public policy space. I feel like it's irresponsible to cede that space to the forces that are actively working to unmake the public sphere. And even though Congress is a disaster, there are lots of other policy spaces. So California is certainly an example of why a state is important, why state policy is important. They've moved a national conversation forward on climate in particular, not always the way I'd like it to go in terms of enshrining market mechanisms, but certainly it's a thing that other parts of the country can look to. But of course, there's a local level. There are regulatory bodies and agencies, and there are international spaces as well that we can take advantage of. And I guess the final reason for me is maybe the most important, and that's, Gar kind of touched on this. In moments of crisis, even in totally dysfunctional bodies like the House and Senate or many governors' mansions, folks look around for the ideas that are lying around, that they've read about in their papers, that they've learned from colleagues, that they've heard about in cocktail parties, and pick them up. And so I think our forces need to be ready and organized to push those good ideas when the moments present themselves. We've missed a bunch of them. In some ways, we missed the Occupy moment, missed the financial crisis. The environmental community certainly missed the BP disaster, and I think we collectively fell down on Katrina. But that doesn't mean we have to miss the next opportunity. And it doesn't mean that we can't build institutions that are actively working behind the scenes to do that. So I thought it would be, and just kind of thinking about this, so where are places, if I really believe this is true, have we ever done this before? Where are places we've possibly done this before? Where we put people's needs over corporate profit, in effect. And I was just trying to think about how, there's the New Deal. That's an example of what we've done in a big way with public policy in the United States. There are some of the environmental rules from the 1970s, which made some forward motion, and of course we're sliding back from those, unfortunately, right now. There's the post-World War II Marshall Plan, where we rebuilt Germany instead of punishing the loser and letting people kind of wallow in debt, crippling debt, which we did after the First World War. And then, there's the Montreal Protocol, where the world came together and is actually reversing the hole in the ozone layer, which is a pretty big deal, actually. And I don't mean to imply, of course, that these policies have worked completely to solve problems they set out to fix, or that they're systems change policies necessarily. But I think they were historic, and I think there are things we can learn about them while we have a broader discussion about how we get to this economics of sustainability and what, in a sense, has worked from those, why they may have worked, or what conditions were in place. And so I've been thinking about, for all of those, there was a moment of destruction. Germany was destroyed, our social contract was destroyed, rivers were catching on fire. in essence, there was a real moment of urgency and desperation. And at the time, we collectively decided to put our public interest in front of profit. We committed political and economic resources, not to our immediate self-interest, but for the long term, in sense of enlightened long-term self-interest. And people were taking on each other's plight in a new way that was serious. So I thought in terms of the New Deal in particular, people were reaching across class boundaries. People have reached across nationalities. People reached across geopolitical lines to think about the interests of someone besides themselves, individually, kind of in an in-group way, in an us-them way, that I think was interesting. I think the other thing that happened in those times is we didn't fall into a, do nothing and watch society collapse moment. So in the New Deal in particular, there was the contestation of, well, maybe we just let this all fall apart, and what blossoms out of the collapse of this form of capitalism is a new and even better form of capitalism. And part of what the New Deal did is say, no, we're not going to let that happen. We're not going to let the market fix itself by sacrificing an entire generation of people. So I think that's what we're kind of up to right now. We could kind of walk away and say, well, this system is so broken that we just let it fail, and we see who's left over at the end. But I think that's not necessarily the right thing to do. Certainly, we cannot leave it up to corporations and capital to do the right thing, but I think we also don't abandon this generation by walking away at this moment. Not that I think anyone would advocate for doing that in this room. So I think there's something to harvest here, especially about the need for public policy that supports the public interest. That's not about propping up the private sector infrastructure with taxpayer dollars with the hope of benefits trickling down to workers or families or students or the environment, but that builds unity across race and class lines in our own country and across north-south divides internationally in particular. So what's missing in our public policy arena right now? What are the kinds of policies we need? I think there are kind of four kinds of ways of linking that we don't do particularly well now that we need to do. And so in my mind, there are pieces like linking environment and inequality in an explicit way, linking resource use and sustainability, reining in consumption, and showing an understanding that climate stability is connected to peace and militarism and vice versa, that those pieces are together. So, of course, we need to be thinking big, and that's, I think, about what this conversation is really centered on, thinking about a systemic transformation. But I do believe, as someone who is super cynical in as many ways as I can possibly think of, that without showing a practical pathway forward, without talking about a transition that really recognizes where we are today and shows people that we can move forward, we can actually do something together, we don't necessarily bring the number of people along, the forces we need, the social movement together to make those changes happen. And I think we need to think about emblematic campaigns. So tangible pieces that we can break off that make a larger political point, but are wins in and of themselves. So we're moving the whole collective conversation forward, but we're actually changing conditions by winning some of these particular campaigns. And I think we have to be honest and think about actions we can do in the policy sphere and otherwise that actually we win even if we lose. So do we move the conversation forward even if we don't get what we were actually aiming for in the first place? So I've been kind of trying to, in the spirit of not having answers, and just thinking about, stuff out loud and in conversation with other folks, I've been trying to think about this idea of like a 5-pronged policy platform. So a lot of folks talk about, there's a whole spectrum of allies we work with at IPS called Caring Across Generations, and they've got a 5-finger plan that makes up the caring hand. And I keep thinking about the 5 fingers of, the fist to move forward and make systems change. And the ones that I'd be really interested in talking to folks about this over lunch, but the kind of 5 fingers that I've been thinking about are around democracy, fighting the concentration of wealth, the whole set of policies that are just say no, the set of policies that are saying yes to something, and then thinking about international platforms. So again, in the demanding democracy, I think we need to be talking about policies that enshrine civil rights and thinks about who has voice. So in particular, those are all the campaigns about getting money out of politics, policy around campaign finance reform, getting fossil fuel industry, military contractors, and their financiers out of the political game, out of the pockets of our decision makers. So we'll hear, of course, more about the move to amend later today, I think, or tomorrow. But I think it also means protecting and rebuilding the voting laws that we've been losing recently, and in expanding the idea of enfranchisement. So that connects up to our migration and labor policies. We need policies that are inclusive and that put pathways to citizenship at the center. Folks like the National Domestic Workers Alliance are doing this, National Guest Workers Alliance, and something called Redefining Work. So second, policies that fight the concentration of wealth, and of course that's the power that wealth brings and inequality. And there are a lot of options out there. A couple two campaigns that I think are really interesting right now are the idea of linking inheritance taxes, so putting inheritance taxes into place, but linking them with public goods like paying for student debt, paying for renewable energy projects, and something called the financial transactions tax, a Robin Hood tax that IPS has been involved in a campaign in the US around that for a number of years now, which is a way to raise money while curbing speculation by putting a tiny tax on Wall Street transactions. So not only does it raise money for the things we know we need, but it takes a little bit of the power out of the sales of the financial sector. And in fact, it's actually happening in 11 European countries this year. Then there's kind of the whole category of just say no. While I appreciate the idea that, asking a political system that's rigged to then regulate the folks that are rigging the system through their dollars is certainly a bit of a snake chasing its own tail. I think we can't abandon that space, and I think it's important to still play in that space. So, of course, that's where we're talking about putting a cap on carbon emissions, and I would even advocate a tax is interesting, but putting a cap on carbon emissions is the most interesting part of that regulation. But there are other spaces where people are working in that, in this idea of just saying no to bad stuff. So Act 250 in Vermont uses the planning process to say, these are things that will not happen in our communities. Municipal planning processes in Maine, for example, do that work. And we need to link those kinds of policies to equity. So we're not seeing that right now in a conversation many of you may be thinking about and learning about, and that's the EPA's new Clean Power Plan, where it's in some ways historic. It's the first time that the US government will be regulating greenhouse gas emissions from electricity generating sources, so coal-fired power plants, all power plants. But what's really problematic is there isn't an analysis of equity. There isn't an analysis of who's impacted by those shifts. So it's not just saying, well, we may lose jobs in our community if we turn off a coal-fired power plant, but it's not even looking at if we switch from coal to natural gas, which may be less emitting where we actually light that fuel on fire, but says nothing about the broader system of where those resources came from, what was emitted in the process of getting to the electricity generating station, or what are the impacts on the communities around that generating station. We miss the big picture of any kind of transition or transformation to a real renewable energy future. I think, of course, rights for nature would be an important piece of that bucket of policy around just saying no. And then there's the whole bucket of what do we want to say yes to. I think that's the broader space around just transition and job creation. And there are, again, real examples of that on the ground right now. And perversely, as I think many policy spaces this happens, it's really moving forward in the Department of Defense. We have community conversion programs at the DoD that specifically target money to communities who are being impacted by our wins in other parts of our progressive circle to slash the military budget. So with the military budget cuts and base closures, there are programs that will help communities convert from manufacturing planes and tanks and instead bring them into renewable energy manufacturing. That's the kind of stuff that's already on the table in our country. And that's the kind of energy and the political will we need to harness for the kinds of work we've been talking about in terms of bringing people out of a destructive economy into one that's focused on what people need and how people do their work. And there are energy investment districts. There's the whole array of zero waste that can happen, zero waste policies that are moving forward. San Francisco, actually, as part of its mandatory recycling and composting ordinance that requires residents and businesses to properly separate recyclables and compostables, are actually helping San Francisco move toward its goal of zero waste by 2020. So those are things that are already happening in different communities around the country and can be enshrined in a public policy platform. I think finally, the last leg of that set of platforms, in my mind, are the international policies that recognize sovereign states above corporations, but also recognize common humanity across political borders. There's a fight right now that Michael didn't talk about, but one of my close colleagues in Washington, D.C. is working really hard on around free trade, stopping fast track. That's the idea of just letting Congress allow free trade agreements to move forward without a real discussion. The Trans-Pacific Partnership is a beautiful example of the problem with that. That would make it really hard for us to even regulate. With all the problems we have now in making regulation work, it would make it almost impossible for us to regulate our greenhouse gas emissions in the midst of a climate crisis, because we could be sued by, let's say, a South Korean company who wants to come and extract fossil fuels from our country. So we're at the cusp of actually tying our own hands through our policies. But we also need policies that connect international peace and international climate security. I think we need to revisit the War Powers Act of the United States as one way of just renewing the conversation about how we move forward in thinking about connecting those two pieces. But really specifically in the next year, we're talking about, in the international community, a new climate treaty, and one that can either enshrine a totally toothless bottom-up approach, in this sense I mean a bad bottom-up approach that just says, I'll do whatever I want and hopefully that will add up to something that saves the planet, but you can't hold me accountable. Or something that's an internationally binding treaty that talks about actually making emissions cuts based on the science and thinking about retooling whole economies so that we're not continuing to invest in the wrong forms of energy, land use, agriculture, transportation, and transit. So, part of I was having a discussion with Bill Twist out in the foyer during their break, and he was really, I think, pushing me, and I think rightly so, to say, just come up with 3 things we can all do together. We can move forward. That can be our policy platform. But I think the problem with that is what we've experienced is that, while the right has done a good job of concentrating the message, they've got ALEC. They've actually got an organization that's looking at policy on every front. And we're not necessarily doing that in a way where we're bringing the diversity of problems, the diversity of fronts in which a policy platform has to be fought from a progressive, from a sustainable point of view, linking them together in one space and thinking about what are the containers that hold those together that we can move forward in a clear narrative. So I'm not saying that public policy will save the planet, but it can be a framework that supports community-based and ecologically grounded transition to a sustainable and more equitable world, but it can also be a barrier. So I hope that part of the action that folks are involved in when they go home, following Mike's encouraging of us to go home and take action, is to really be involved in the policy space, whether it's in your local municipality or thinking about national politics or looking at the state policy space, and really think about how that's a part of a fundamental shift. It's part of the transition toward a fundamental shift to a new system. So thank you.